Hi everyone, this is Josh from Narrate. This past weekend was the fourth of our 5-part series, Give and Take. Adam talked about how givers use language in relationships.
Do you ever find yourself with this sense that, do you ever find yourself disappointed at your own spiritual progress? And I don't mean the knowledge piece, not that that's not important. I think we all would agree that that's a foundation to the stuff that really matters. But I mean, do you ever find yourself relapsing, so to speak? Whether it's to anger or to substance, whether it's to a particular website or a particularly bad habit, and you thought you were done with that? Ever find yourself dealing with that emotion where there's a sense of like, I prayed, I read a book, we did a series, like we did all this work, and I just lost my temper again? It strikes me that you might be among the many who, quite frankly, are struggling to even believe in God at this place, at this juncture, because sometimes the easier thing is to believe that the God who supposedly can change you doesn't exist than it is to believe that you're incapable of changing, you know? I recently heard somebody kind of processing all this, and I thought, man, what an important, honest thing to confess, that sometimes after months or even years of work, it can be pretty discouraging to know that we're still struggling with that. And again, that is probably all over the board in this room, but I'm guessing one of the things that we could all kind of agree that we struggle with, we've even done series on this, are the words that we speak. You ever find yourself going like, dang it, I said I was never going to do that in an argument again. I said I was never going to threaten like that again. I was never going to lose my cool again. Hey, anybody struggle with their words? You're all a bunch of liars. You struggle with words and lying. That's the problem. So I had this experience this last fall that was a reminder to me that my greatest struggle, despite the fact that I've spent countless hours in James in particular, where James talks about the power of language, this experience for me kind of encapsulated all of the struggle I had with words. It was a Monday morning, which is my day off. My wife was working, which doesn't always happen on Mondays, which means I was up and kind of before I would go for my run, was getting the boys ready for school, and off to school, they get themselves ready for school. It was just my responsibility to drive the car to which they exit out of. But I looked out my back window, which overlooks my backyard, which looks into the alley where I have a detached 2-car garage and an alley access gravel driveway, and I looked and there was a Dodge Caravan parked in the driveway. The only problem is I don't own a Dodge Caravan. Not anymore anyway. Now, that wasn't all that shocking because there's these apartments that are kind of directly behind our house, and we've had this history of people parking not in front of their house, but next to the garbage can, and it's kind of an inconvenience, but not that big a deal. I just figured somebody was brazen enough to park in my driveway this time. And you know when you have that sense of like, I can't give this too much attention or it's going to derail my whole day? You know that thing? So I was like, okay, so I'm going to deal with this after I get home from school, after I go for my run, because I can tell this thing has the potential to take up my entire Monday, and I want to get some school done, and I want to get some selfishness done, and so I'm just not going to do it. And so I took the boys to school, came back, and in one of those moments of spontaneity, thought, well, I'm at least going to call dispatch and tell them what's going on. So I called dispatch, and it was one of the world's quickest conversations. I was like, hey, so just so you know, there's a van parked in my driveway. And she said, oh, well, your driveway's private property, nothing we can do about it. Sorry, click. I mean, that was that was the conversation. And I thought, well, that's interesting, and I suppose legally true. But I decided to go for my run, went for my run, and I don't know about you, part of the reason why I love exercise is because it's one of the only times in my life that I can sustain a single thought for more than 10 seconds. It's also where I feel like I'm most creative, though many of my creative ideas aren't good ones. They feel like it when you're exercising, right? Have you ever noticed that? Like, you've invented the new iPhone on a run. So on my run, I decided that I'd watched a friend one time move a car that he had purchased. It was an old car they didn't have keys to, by putting a jack underneath the front axle, and the jack had 4 wheels on it, and so he could move the thing wherever he wanted. And so we moved it down the driveway and got it on his trailer. And I thought to myself, I've got an idea. There's this old piece of OSB in my backyard that I've been needing to cut up for years, haven't done that yet so I could throw it away. I'm going to lay that thing underneath the van. I'm going to put my jack under it. I've only got to push it like 3 feet, and suddenly it's not in my driveway, it's in their alley. And then all of a sudden, eventually the garbage man or somebody's going to come along, and they're going to go like, hey, there's a van in our alley, and then they'll have to deal with it. That was my master plan. Don't know if I'd have been brazen enough to do it. Because when I got home, just before I walked in my front door, I noticed my neighbor Joe was outside. And Joe is, I suspect, 50-something. I know he owns a bunch of commercial real estate. And so I told him this story, and he's like, oh, Adam, this is easy. All you need to do is call them and tell them that there's this car parked there. They'll come put a sticker on it. They'll impound it. They'll tow it away. Then when the owner wants their car back, then they'll have to pay the impound fee. Do that. So I picked up the phone, knowing that, okay, here goes my whole day, right? Pick up the phone, and I said, hey, so it's me again, the one with the problem in his driveway. My neighbor told me, and she stopped me, she said, hey, would you give me the license plate number of that van? And I was like, oh, sweet, we're getting somewhere. So I walked out into the driveway, read her the license plate number. There was a long, awkward pause, and she said, that van has been reported as stolen. I said, sweet, now I'm in control. So she said, an officer will be to your house in just a few minutes. So I was standing outside, smelling of BO and having just run, waiting for the officer to show up. And he showed up and he said, okay, so Adam, here's the deal. The van was stolen. It was stolen from a seedy hotel. There were probably drugs involved. The owner has decided he doesn't want to press charges. So we've called him, given him your address, and he's on his way to pick up his van. Exactly. That's the same thought I had. And my neighbor Joe and I, we both looked at him and I said, does it occur to you like that it's a little ironic what you just said? And he literally said, oh, Adam, people who use drugs walk by your house every day. So that morning, I'd studied Jesus' clearing of the temple and the tension that we have as middle-class people to make sure we're using our power and resource to serve under-resourced people. So I'm sitting here going like, okay, so what do you suggest? And he said, just let him come get his van. Okay, I'll let him come get his van. A couple hours later, I was sitting in my office at my house. Window looks out into the backyard. I heard a noise. Lean, look out the window. There's now two men, both wearing army jackets, with a coat hanger, trying to break into the van. So I pick up the phone. I don't know now, is it the guy who stole the van or the guy who owns the van? I don't know. So I pick up the phone, and I said, hey, just so you know, it's me again, the guy who's a pain in your butt that has the van in his driveway. Now there's somebody with a coat hanger trying to break into the van. She said, oh, does it look like, is it a green coat and blah, blah, blah? And I said, yeah. And she said, oh, that's the owner. She said, he only had one key. He's hoping the person who stole the van left it in the ignition, which is what you do when you steal a van, right? You just, in case somebody wants their van back, I better leave the key for them. So you just suggest that this is normal. Yeah, this is normal. Okay. 2:15, I'm going to pick up my kids. Driving there, now I'm getting a little more frustrated because my kids, one of their chores is to take the garbage out, but now I'm like, I can't tell them to take the garbage out because there's this weird van back there. It's still there. There's no people there. So I called again and I said, hey, could I talk to that officer again? And I'm like, there's got to be something else that we could do here. And I don't want to misrepresent it because I realize only one of us has a microphone, but it was more or less like, Adam, what we could do is have him removed from your property for trespassing. That's really what you have within your rights. Or you could give the guy a break because he's on tough luck and let him get his own van back. It'll be fine. So, okay, I guess what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a pastor. What is that about? Compassion. So I said, okay. 6 o'clock rolls around. It's time to take the garbage out. Van's still there. I go to take the garbage out. And when you're a kid, it's kind of getting dark. Remember when you take the garbage out? You don't have to admit if you still do this as an adult, but you could swear someone's following you back to the fence and you kind of run, but you don't tell anybody that you ran. That's the way I felt. And as I walked past the van on my way back, there was something moving in the van. So after I soiled myself, I turned around, and a guy came flying out of the side of the van. He's probably in his 30s, built, clean-shaven, clean clothes. He identifies himself, and he said, hey, just so you know, this is my van. I'm going to sleep here tonight. So again, like, what am I to do? Because now the quandary is this. If I lay down the gauntlet, tomorrow morning there's a brick thrown through my window, right? Like, that's part of what I'm feeling here is how much can I do here? Because suddenly the guy knows me, knows where he lives. Plus, I don't like confrontation, and I'm kind of a wuss. And so I was like, oh, okay, so what are you going to do? He said, tomorrow I'll call the locksmith, and I'll get a new key made, and I'll get it out of here in the morning. So I get out here in the morning. Yep, okay. So I go inside, and I'm literally thinking, so, do I make the guy a sandwich? I just don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Next morning, because kids are sleeping in the house, wife's home. I mean, it's just this crazy, weird scenario. Next morning, van's still there. We had an ALES meeting that afternoon. We were walking back from the ALES meeting, and my wife was on that team, and she's like, hey, just so you know, haven't seen the guy all day, and the van's there. So I got home, and I don't know if you have this, but, there's this button on my forearm that just activates my Hushka genes. Right? And I don't mean this is disrespectful towards my dad. We've actually laughed about this. But when it comes to words, part of what I struggle with is I know that when you don't get your way, you just get louder, right? And if you don't like the answer, just get more aggressive and more demanding. And I could do it at Target. I could do it on the phone. And so I just activated the button. Don't like to activate the button. Called dispatch again, but I'd already pre-decided, listen, we're not taking no for an answer here. This is ridiculous. Something's got to happen. And it's not that I had to get threatening, but I did have to get aggressive, and I did kind of go I need to appeal up. Who else can I talk to about this situation? Something has got to give here. And at 10 o'clock that night, the van was towed away from my house at no expense to me. And the next morning, I was walking to work, And I was just confused. In fact, I remember saying to the staff when we got there, we just hired Hannah. Hannah's her maiden name is also Hushka. We don't think we're related, but our dads are both railroaders from eastern Montana. Nonetheless, I said to them, I said, I'm so confused because as a follower of Christ, I'm so trying to work on that whole, like when I don't get my way, just get mean and angry and loud and aggressive and you'll eventually get your way. And Hannah's like, we might be related. Like that's what I learned. And I said, and the struggle here is nothing really happened until I did that. And it's just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. This morning what I want to talk about is words, because I'm guessing that I'm not the only one that struggles with the tension, that sometimes it feels like the only way you get things done is by getting aggressive with your words, and yet we're probably all, whether you've read James chapter 1 or not, all know that few things create more damage in our hearts and the hearts of people we're trying to love and serve than the words that we use. Though we might say them emotionally, though we might not mean them, they stick. And so this morning as we continue in this give and take conversation, the question I want to ask is how do givers use language? And if you've not been with us since Christmas Eve, really what we've been exploring is not so much you either are or you aren't, but when you are functioning as a giver, when you are living your life as though you're not just in it for yourself, in this case of this morning, I want to ask, how do those people talk? How do you talk? How do I talk when we're actually functioning from a both and kind of perspective? From a desire to get what's best for them as well as at times ourselves. And for this, in my view, for inspiration, we really have to look no further than Jesus. Right? Like, if you were to start going like, what gives you confirmation, Adam, that Jesus was uniquely the Son of God? Of course, we start with the resurrection and we look to the cross. I'm going to also look at the way he used his language. It's astounding. Jesus, it's not that he never said hard things. He did. That's what makes it so amazing. But he seemed to never be reacting, never to be responding emotionally, always to being true and truthful, sometimes graceful, and sometimes just full-on, guns blaring, we need truth in this instance. The one that challenges me the most, and to me sets the high watermark of words, happened near the end of his life. You may know that right before he died, of course, he was arrested. And for years, at least months, the authorities were trying to arrest Jesus. The problem was he was so good at hide and seek. It was like ever since he was 2 years old, like, let's play hide and seek. And then he'd be like, okay, Jesus, we can't find you. Where are you? And that was the dynamic of the final months of his life. Because, see, the authorities, they couldn't arrest him in public because that would have started a revolt. And yet he had this way of kind of disappearing into the night, and they couldn't find him. And so one of his best friends sold him out. A guy named Judas went to the authorities and said, hey, I'll tell you where he hides, as long as you give me the assurance that you're not going to arrest the rest of the band. Like, just mess with him. And some historians think that Judas was actually trying to do something other than betray him, but actually kind of push forward his kingdom agenda. But nonetheless, the interaction there just, to me, it's astounding. Verse 47 of Matthew chapter 26 is where we get Matthew, his version. It says, while he was still speaking, that he being Jesus, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him, a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders and the people. Now, the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man, arrest him. Of course, this is some kind of cultural thing that we're not going to get into this morning. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus' response messes with me. Listen to what he says. Do what you came for, friend. Some translations argue that we should translate this, why have you come, friend? Can you imagine being that rocked, that surprised, that betrayed, and continuing to put relationship and loving people above everything else? I think that's the high watermark for us as we talk about words. How do we stay that in control of our language? And I was thrilled when I bumped into this research by Adam Grant because he notes 4 things that givers do with words. The first one is that givers express vulnerability. He tells a story of a time when early in his career, Adam Grant, he was hired to train some F-16 pilots. These were seasoned veteran F-16 pilots. He says the moxie and bravado of Tom Cruise's Top Gun cast does justice to the scene. These men and women who were the very top of expertise, who had hundreds of hours of combat experience, thousands of hours of actual F-16 flight experience. He was called in his early 30s to do this training for them. He was nervous. He could see that they felt twice his age. He started his training by listing all of his credentials, all his accolades, all his education, everything that qualified him to be doing this training. What followed was a day or so's worth of training. At the end, they evaluated the training, and it was brutal. The reviews said things like, we couldn't learn anything from this guy. He didn't say anything I haven't heard before. How do you expect us to learn somebody who's young enough to be our son? It was just brutal, harsh review. He was devastated. Months later, he was given a second chance. Different set of upper echelon pilots, and he did everything the same, save one thing. At the beginning, he started it a little bit differently. In the midst of his nervousness and the reality that he was almost twice their age, he started by saying this: I'm guessing you're thinking, what could you possibly learn from a 25-year-old punk like me? There was this awkward silence, and then the room erupted into laughter. And then the chief alpha of them, the most macho of them all, said, actually, I was thinking, what could we learn from a 15-year-old? I'm grateful to know you're 25. That 20 seconds is the only thing he changed about his presentation. The reviews were completely different than the first one. The reviews said things like, he had great things to say, hadn't thought about a lot of the ideas he brought up. You should bring him back. He's a genius. What is that? Well, the research would say that when competence partners with, matches with vulnerability, it somehow communicates to people that you're not just in it for yourself. Another study, they took a quiz bowl team. So quiz bowl teams, of course, are those groups that they're going to do quizzes, and it's their sport. And they took a team and they formed a study around this team's desire to add members. And of course, they controlled the group of people they'd be calling, and they made the control group that they were calling comprised of two groups of people. One were these people who were so extraordinarily intelligent on the types of questions they were going to ask that they would get 90% of the questions right. And of course, part of the interview was they would ask these types of questions that they would hear in the game. The other were the types of people who would get about 30% right. So they're normal people like me and many of you. They just were like, okay, I could get maybe 1 out of 3 right, especially if it's about the Broncos. Then they added a couple variables throughout the interview. Periodically, they would have one of the 30%ers or one of the 90%ers towards the end of this phone interview pretend, act like they spilled a cup of coffee. And so they'd go, oh no, I just spilled coffee all over my lap. The result was that the 30%ers, the team interviewing them, they liked them even less. But the 90%ers, the high competence folks, those were the ones that the interviewers actually chose to be on their team. See, what they found is, again, when a person of high competence matches with vulnerability, somehow it communicates that you're not just an egotist. The second thing that givers do with their language is they ask questions. Asking questions, James Penamaker, a researcher on this, says asking questions unlocks what he calls the joy of talking. He did a study where they took a stranger and told this stranger that they were going to put him in a small group or her in a small group and that they could choose the topic of conversation. They then moved this stranger into this small group of people who would start this conversation, and then 15 minutes in, they would pull the stranger out of the group and they would ask them 2 questions. The first one was, did you like that small group of people? Now, there was a corresponding relationship there. And you're probably one step ahead of me in terms of what it was. What they found was the more the stranger talked, the more they actually liked the small group. And you go, okay, well, that is somewhat ironic, but it also makes sense because most of us enjoy talking about ourselves. But then they asked a second question. The second question they asked was, how well did you get to know that group of people that we put you with? And it was actually the same relationship. The more the stranger talked, the more they left the interaction feeling like they got to know the group of people. Which, of course, is fundamentally not accurate. But it captures this idea that when people talk, they feel connection. What they demonstrate over and over and over again is people who can effectively communicate, they're not just in it for themselves. Parents and spouses and friends who can somehow convey with language what they feel in their heart, which is a desire to put others before themselves. Part of the way they do that is they ask good questions and they stand back. There's another study that just simply asked this question. Go ahead, next slide. will you vote in the next presidential election? And I get the sense that it's like with bells on. That's from both sides. Like that's kind of the idea right now, right? What they found is that when you ask somebody a question about something that they already agree is important, the likelihood of their actually doing it goes up 40% when you ask it versus tell it. They've done this with dentists. To say, you need to floss, versus, are you going to floss this week? 40% difference when you ask versus when you tell. They've done it with doctors. Are you going to start avoiding foods high in fat? To ask versus to tell. And what they say, what the researchers say, is the reason is when you ask a question, you actually activate a person's own ability to self-motivate, and somehow they step forward in that. When you tell them, they're reliant upon your motivational energy. When you ask them, they get to utilize their own. Third one, as they say, givers talk tentative. Allison Fraggle is this researcher at the University of North Carolina, and she points out, she actually has a TED Talk that you can listen to on a couple different things, I believe. But she talks about when you use these kind of hesitation-type language, it actually conveys, again, that you want to form a team, that it's not just about you overpowering. She calls them hesitations. She says when you say things like, well, you know, that kind of nervous stutter, it actually conveys a giver's approach. She also has a category she calls hedges. Just including the word like kinda or sorta or maybe or probably or I think suddenly causes people to trust you more. Disclaimers. This may be a bad idea, but makes a world of difference. She also talks about tag questions. That's interesting, isn't it? Or that's a good idea, right? See, there's something that happens, she says, when you just allow yourself to hesitate in your language. Now, what I love about this is you kind of can't fake it. Right? Like, you know when you know that you know that you know, and you sound different. But sometimes I wonder if what we need to do is give ourselves permission to not know, to slow down and go, wait a minute. I don't have to have this one. I don't have to pretend that I do have it. In fact, part of what she says is that when you do this, you convey to your audience that you lack confidence, and you go, well, that's bad, right? And she says, not if what you're trying to do is create a team. When you lack confidence, when you lack authority, that's one of her other key words. Words like kinda and I think, they actually undermine your own authority, which she says is a great thing if you're trying to actually create team. Fourth things givers do, and I know we're just kind of fire hosing you, but she says givers seek advice. In 2007, there was a Fortune 500 company that closed their operations in the Midwest and moved everything to the East Coast. One of the employees affected by that, of course, hundreds and thousands lost their jobs. Others were given the option to relocate. One of them was a woman named Annie. Annie was enrolled in an MBA program in this town. It was an MBA program that was being paid for by the company. She was also an up-and-coming research scientist within the company, and she was offered a job on the East Coast, so she found herself in a dilemma. If she stayed, she was without a job that was paying for education. If she went, she couldn't finish her education at the place where she started it, and there would be all these overlap of credits. She didn't know what to do. She spent days, over a week, contemplating what to do. Finally, she picked up the phone and called the head of HR and did something that researchers said was a brilliant, perfect move. She told the head of HR her dilemma, and then she asked one question. She simply said, "So what would you do if you were me?" That question activated the HR director in her problem. She spent the next couple weeks trying to problem solve for her, and eventually Annie was presented with this option that she ultimately took. What the company decided was, tell you what, you move to the East Coast with us. Part of our design on closing these operations is it's cheaper for us to fly our corporate jet to that city every Tuesday and Thursday round trip. So here's the deal. You move to the East Coast. You can fly in the corporate jet every Tuesday and Thursday at no cost to yourself. We'll rent a car so you can get from the airport to your school, and then you can work here and live on the East Coast. To which she said, okay. They did another similar study with real estate agents. They asked these commercial real estate agents, they wanted to know when a broker or when an agent signs on a piece of property with an owner to try to sell that piece of property, what's the highest rate of success? What they found in this one study was that when real estate agents decide at the forefront that their highest priority is getting the maximum price for the property, in this study's case, they sold on 8% of the listings. But when instead the real estate agent looked at the owner, the prospective seller, and said, or the seller, not the prospective seller, and asked one question, it went up to 40%. That question was simply this: what are your priorities for this sale? Made a 32% difference. Listened to one podcast recently with an expert hostage negotiator who said his biggest secret to negotiations is simply, how do you want me to do this? What do you expect me to do with this? So someone would say to him, like, I need $2 million and a flight to Cuba. And he would say, how do you expect me to do that when I don't even know if my son's alive? Activates them. He said the best thing to do with a conversation is put the power back on the other. See, part of what comes up about this whole asking for advice thing is it really requires all the other ones, doesn't it? You have to be vulnerable. That's why we don't want to ask for advice, because it makes us vulnerable. You have to ask a question by its very nature. And if you're asking for advice, you're hesitating with your own preconceived notions. I'll say this. Among the top 3 most important things I've learned since getting the chance to lead this movement has been the power of the council. And don't get me wrong, the council is a remarkable group of people. But in some ways, it has nothing to do with the council. It has everything to do with the practice of going, okay, this one's bigger than me. In fact, this one's big, period. Let's put it out there. Let's have conversation about this. I'm going to ask advice on this one. It's been the most, or at least top 3 most valuable things I've learned, and that's why I'm so grateful for that team. You know, the text talks a lot about asking for advice. And it strikes me that I think all too often what we see is God as this power monger who just wants to tell us what to do. But that's not the way the text portrays it. Listen to Proverbs, which is full, and I mean full of, and I put them all on your mind map. I just want to look at a few of just, remember Proverbs are these ancient provisions of wisdom, like how do wise people live? They're not intended to be formulas because, like any formula, they don't always work. It's not to say that you'll always get success, but the idea is best practices. Here's how it works. Listen to Proverbs. Chapter 11, verse 14, for lack of guidance, a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisors. 12:15, where there is strife, there is pride, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. Did I just skip around? I did, didn't I? That's the one I was supposed to end with. There's a bunch more on your mind map. Listen, in just a minute, we're going to give you a chance to reflect through communion. We'll have elements over here, and I believe up in the balcony. Just a reminder that we dip, we don't sip. But let's just remind ourselves why we do communion. We do communion because we recognize that there is a source of wisdom bigger than ourselves. That Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, said, hey, I'm here for you. This is my body broken for you. The wine, it symbolizes his blood poured out for you, for us. It's a reminder that this God is that committed to us. It's a reminder that this God stands by and goes, I would love to see you thrive, and I've even made provisions for that. But speaking of words and the power of words, you know, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's 3 Hebrew words for sin. The first one is the word shatah. Go ahead to that next slide. It's nothing like how you say it. You have to sound like you're about ready to purr like a cat to say anything Hebrew. It's that shatah. Like it's the purring. Shatah means to miss a mark. It shows up throughout the text. Avah is another word. It means to act wrongly. Shatah, by the way, is the word that refers to David when he arranged for Uriah's death so he could marry Bathsheba. Avah is the word, this deals more directly with an intentional violation of a commandment from God. This is the word that the Old Testament uses when it talks about Eli's sons purposely stealing meat from the offering. The third one is pashah. It means to rebel. This is the most devious. This is the most undermining of all of those. But here's the thing. Every one of them, and every time the text speaks of sin, its concern is what it does to relationship. The Bible's concern with sin is not that there's this arbitrary list and God wants to see whether or not you're good enough to follow it. God's concern with sin over and over and over and over again is he loathes what sin does to relationship. The one you might have with him, could have with him, did have with him, and the one he wants you to have with those that you live your life with. It's not an arbitrary thing. It's a God who understands the breakdown of relationship, the tragedy of that breakdown. Communion is a God who's made provision, who understands we have violated relationship with him in ways beyond what we can even comprehend, and he's made provision. Communion is a reminder that no healthy relationship exists outside the need for grace and forgiveness. This morning, as we talk about words and the power that they have and the havoc they could wreak, maybe as we move into communion, we could just remind ourselves that they're not just words that destroy, but they're words that destroy relationship. And that this God has provided a way out of that destruction in our relationship with him and modeled for us what it looks like to have healthy relationship with others. I'd like to pray, and the band will lead us through a couple songs as you partake of communion. God, Lord, we recognize that sin is this giant loaded word that we have all kinds of emotional responses to, and God, we just want to simplify that a bit and recognize that, like the words that we so often speak, sin interrupts relationship. It violates relationship, and that your chief concern has been and always will be relationships. Ours with you, ours with one another, ours with ourselves, ours with creation. Thanks, God, for the cross. Thanks that the tomb was empty. Thanks for modeling to us grace and forgiveness. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.